At family dinner, my sister raised her glass and said, "None of this would be possible without me." My aunt laughed. My mom smirked. Not everyone can freeload forever. I took a sip of water, pulled out my phone, and said, "Cool. Should have told the lawyer the rest of this property isn't even supposed to be here." Then the room went quiet. I, 29M, sat at the dinner table watching my sister bask in what she thought was her moment of triumph. The whole family had gathered at what used to be our grandmother's house, the same house where I'd spent countless summers as a kid, learning to ride bikes in the driveway and helping Grandma tend to her garden. Now it belonged to my parents, or so everyone believed. My sister raised her wine glass with that familiar smug expression she'd worn since we were teenagers. She announced to everyone that none of this would be possible without her, gesturing around the renovated dining room like she was some kind of benefactor. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd been living rent-free in the guest house for 3 years, contributing nothing while I'd been sending money home every month to help with the mortgage payments. My aunt started laughing, that uncomfortable kind of laugh people do when they're trying to fill awkward silence. She mentioned something about family always supporting each other, but I could see the strain in her smile. She knew the real situation just like everyone else at that table. That's when my mom decided to twist the knife. She looked directly at me with this satisfied smirk and commented about how not everyone can freeload forever. The words hit exactly as she intended them to. Here I was, the one who'd been financially supporting this household for years, being called a freeloader while my sister got praised for doing absolutely nothing. I took a slow sip of water, letting the comment hang in the air while I pulled out my phone. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then I spoke up, keeping my voice calm and casual. I told them that was interesting, and they should have mentioned that to the lawyer, especially since the rest of this property wasn't even supposed to be here. The room went dead quiet. You could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the corner, the same clock that had been there since I was 5 years old. My sister's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, and my mom's smirk disappeared entirely. My dad was the first to break the silence. He asked me what I meant by that comment, his voice carrying a nervous edge I'd never heard before. I could see him exchanging glances with my mom, both of them trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I wasn't bluffing. 6 months earlier, I'd hired a property lawyer to help me understand some inheritance documents that had been sitting in my grandmother's old desk. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about our family's financial situation. The original property deed showed that Grandma's house sat on a much smaller lot than what my parents currently owned. Over the years, they'd been gradually expanding onto adjacent land that technically belonged to the county. My aunt leaned forward, asking what kind of lawyer I was talking about. I could see the curiosity mixed with concern in her eyes. She'd always been the most level-headed person in our family, the one who asked the right questions when everyone else was busy arguing. I explained that I'd been researching property records for months. The house itself was legitimate, but the expanded driveway, the new garage my dad built 2 years ago, and about half of the backyard where my sister's guest house sat were all on land that hadn't been properly acquired. My parents had simply assumed it belonged to them and built accordingly. My sister finally found her voice. She demanded to know why I was bringing this up now, why I was trying to ruin a perfectly nice family dinner. Her tone had shifted from smugness to panic, and I realized she was starting to understand the implications. I told her I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I was simply pointing out that before anyone started talking about who was freeloading and who deserved credit, maybe we should establish who actually had legal claim to what. The guest house where she'd been living rent-free for 3 years was sitting on county land that my parents had never purchased or properly leased. My mom's face had gone pale. She asked if I was threatening them, if this was my way of getting back at them for some perceived slight. I could hear the defensiveness in her voice, but underneath it was genuine fear. I wasn't threatening anyone, I explained. I was simply sharing information I discovered. The county had been conducting property surveys in this area for the past year, preparing for some new development projects. Eventually, they were going to discover what I'd already found out. When that happened, there would be fines, legal complications, and probably forced removal of any structures built on land they didn't own. My dad set down his fork and asked exactly what kind of trouble we were looking at. I could see him doing mental calculations, probably trying to figure out how much this was going to cost to fix. He'd always been the practical one, the problem solver, but this was bigger than anything he'd dealt with before. I pulled up some documents on my phone and explained what my lawyer had found. The county records showed clear boundary markers that my parents had ignored when they'd expanded the property. The garage alone represented about $15,000 in construction costs that might have to be completely removed. The guest house was an even bigger problem since it was a permanent structure with plumbing and electrical work. My sister's panic was becoming more obvious by the minute. She asked what this meant for her living situation, whether she was going to have to move out immediately. For the first time in years, she wasn't acting like she owned the place. I told her that depended on how my parents wanted to handle the situation. They could try to purchase or lease the additional land from the county, assuming it was even available for sale. They could remove the structures that violated the property boundaries. Or they could wait for the county to discover the problem themselves and face much steeper penalties. My aunt asked how long I'd known about this situation. There was something in her tone that suggested she suspected I'd been holding onto this information, waiting for the right moment to use it. She wasn't wrong. I'd known about the property issues for 4 months. Initially, I'd planned to quietly approach my parents and help them resolve the situation. But after months of snide comments about my contributions to the family, after watching my sister get praised for doing nothing while I got criticized for everything, I decided to wait for a more opportune moment. Tonight had provided that moment perfectly. My mom asked why I'd hired a lawyer in the first place, what had prompted me to start digging into property records. I could see her trying to figure out if this was all part of some elaborate plan to hurt the family. I explained that I'd been considering buying my own house and wanted to understand how property inheritance worked. While researching, I noticed some discrepancies in Grandma's original deed compared to the current property layout. One thing led to another, and I discovered the full extent of the boundary violations. My dad wanted to know what it would cost to fix everything legally. His practical nature was kicking in, trying to find a solution that wouldn't destroy the family financially. I respected him for that, even though I was frustrated with how he'd been treating me lately. According to my lawyer, the costs could vary dramatically depending on the county's willingness to negotiate. If they were willing to sell the additional land, it might cost anywhere from $30,000 to $50,000 plus legal fees. If they demanded removal of existing structures, the cost could easily exceed $100,000 when you factored in demolition, rebuilding, and penalties. My sister had gone completely silent, probably calculating how much of her comfortable rent-free lifestyle was about to disappear. The guest house that had been her refuge from adult responsibilities was potentially going to be condemned by the county. My aunt asked if there was anything that could be done to minimize the legal exposure. She'd always been good at finding practical solutions to family problems, and I could see her mind working through possible approaches. I told her my lawyer had suggested several strategies. The first priority was to contact the county proactively rather than waiting for them to discover the violations. Being upfront about the situation and showing good faith effort to resolve it could result in reduced penalties. The second step was to get proper surveys done to establish exactly which structures were affected and by how much. My mom finally spoke up again. She asked if I was expecting them to thank me for creating this crisis, for potentially destroying everything they'd worked to build. I could hear years of frustration in her voice, but also genuine confusion about why I was doing this now. I told her I hadn't created this crisis. I'd simply discovered it. The violations had existed for years, getting worse every time they'd expanded or built something new without checking property boundaries. Eventually, someone was going to notice, whether it was me, the county, or a neighbor with their own property concerns. My dad asked what I wanted from them, what my endgame was in revealing all this information. He seemed to understand that this wasn't just about property boundaries. This was about years of family dynamics that had finally reached a breaking point. I didn't want anything from them, I explained. I wanted them to understand that before anyone started throwing around accusations about who was contributing and who was freeloading, maybe they should look at the actual situation. I'd been helping to pay for improvements and expansions on property they didn't even legally own, while getting criticized for not doing enough. My sister finally found her voice again. She accused me of trying to destroy the family out of petty jealousy, of using legal technicalities to get revenge for imagined slights. Her defensive anger was understandable, but it missed the point entirely. I wasn't destroying anything, I told her. I was revealing problems that already existed. If she wanted to talk about petty behavior, maybe she should consider how she'd been treating the person who'd been financially supporting the household while she lived rent-free and contributed nothing. The conversation continued for another hour, with emotions running high and everyone trying to figure out what came next. Eventually, we agreed that my parents would meet with my lawyer the following week to discuss their options. My sister would need to start looking for alternative housing arrangements, at least temporarily, while the legal situation got resolved. Update 1. The lawyer meeting happened 3 days later. My parents brought their own attorney, which was probably smart given the complexity of the situation. What emerged from that meeting was even more complicated than any of us had anticipated. The property violations were worse than my initial research had revealed. My parents' lawyer discovered that not only had they built on county land, but some of their expansions had also encroached on 2 neighboring properties. The previous owners had never complained, probably because they hadn't realized what was happening, but that didn't make the violations any less serious. My dad called me that evening to fill me in on the details. His voice sounded tired, older somehow, as he explained what they'd learned. The total cost to resolve everything legally was going to be somewhere between $120,000 to $150,000. That included purchasing the county land if possible, compensating the neighbors for their property encroachments, legal fees, and penalties for the years of violations. He asked if I'd be willing to help them financially, given that I'd been the one to discover the problems. I could hear the defeat in his voice, and despite everything that had happened, I felt genuinely sorry for him. He'd worked hard his entire life, and now he was facing the possibility of losing everything because of mistakes he'd made without realizing their consequences. I told him I'd think about it, but first I wanted to see some changes in how the family dynamics worked. I was tired of being treated like I was the problem when I'd been trying to help all along. If they wanted my continued support, financial or otherwise, things were going to have to be different. My sister had moved out of the guest house within a week, finding a small apartment across town that she could barely afford on her part-time income. Suddenly, she was learning what it meant to pay rent and utilities and buy her own groceries. The transition wasn't going smoothly. She called me 2 weeks after the lawyer meeting, asking if we could talk. Her tone was different, less entitled, more uncertain. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and for the first time in years, she actually listened when I spoke. She apologized for how she'd been treating me, admitting that she'd gotten comfortable taking my contributions for granted while criticizing me for things that didn't really matter. She acknowledged that she'd been living in a bubble of privilege that wasn't sustainable, and that my revelation about the property had forced her to confront some uncomfortable truths about her own behavior. I appreciated the apology, but I told her it was going to take time to rebuild the trust and respect that had been damaged over the years. She nodded, seeming to understand that this wasn't something that could be fixed with a single conversation. Update 2. 3 months later, the legal situation had mostly been resolved. My parents managed to purchase most of the county land at a reduced rate after negotiating in good faith and agreeing to bring everything up to current code standards. The neighbor situations were more complicated, requiring some creative property line adjustments and modest financial compensation. I ended up contributing about $40,000 to help resolve the legal issues, but with clear conditions. My parents signed a formal agreement acknowledging my financial contributions and giving me an ownership stake in the property proportional to what I'd invested over the years. It wasn't about the money as much as it was about recognition and respect for what I'd been contributing. My sister had managed to keep her apartment and was working full-time for the first time in years. The transition had been difficult, but she seemed to be developing a better understanding of financial responsibility. She'd even started paying back some of the money she'd borrowed from my parents over the years. The family dynamic had shifted significantly. My parents were more careful about their comments regarding everyone's contributions, and there was a new level of transparency about financial matters that hadn't existed before. My mom made a point of acknowledging my help publicly, something she'd rarely done in the past. We had dinner again at the house last month, almost 6 months after the original incident. The conversation was more balanced, more respectful. My sister didn't make any grand announcements about her contributions, and my mom didn't make any snide comments about freeloading. During dessert, my aunt mentioned that she was proud of how the family had handled such a difficult situation. She said it had forced everyone to confront some uncomfortable truths, but that the outcome had been healthier relationships and better communication. I agreed with her assessment. The revelation about the property violations had been painful and expensive, but it had also cleared the air about years of resentment and misunderstanding. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force people to address problems they've been avoiding. My dad pulled me aside as I was leaving that evening. He thanked me again for helping resolve the legal issues, but more importantly, he thanked me for forcing the family to have conversations that were long overdue. He admitted that they'd all gotten too comfortable with patterns of behavior that weren't fair or sustainable. As I drove home that night, I reflected on everything that had happened. The revenge aspect hadn't been as satisfying as I'd expected. What felt better was the genuine resolution, the improved relationships, and the sense that everyone in the family had a clearer understanding of their roles and responsibilities. Update 3. A year later, the family relationships have continued to improve. My sister has been promoted at her job and is considering going back to school to finish her degree. She's also started contributing to family expenses when possible, something that would have been unthinkable before. My parents have been much more appreciative of my contributions, both financial and otherwise. They've also become more independent, taking on some expenses they used to expect me to cover. The property is now completely legal and up to code, which has actually increased its value significantly. The guest house has been converted into a legitimate rental unit, providing my parents with additional income. Ironically, my sister is considering moving back into it once she's saved enough money, but this time as a paying tenant with a proper lease agreement. I learned that sometimes the most effective revenge isn't about hurting people. It's about forcing them to confront the truth about their behavior and its consequences. The property revelation had been my nuclear option, but it had also been the catalyst for changes that needed to happen anyway. The family still has its challenges, but there's more honesty now, more mutual respect. When problems arise, we address them directly instead of letting resentment build up over years. It's not perfect, but it's healthier than it was before. Looking back, I'm glad I chose that particular moment to reveal what I discovered. It was dramatic, certainly, but it was also effective in ways that a private conversation never could have been. Sometimes you have to shake up the entire system to create the space for real change.